All right. Hello, you guys. So I'm going to be talking about the first two topics here of Unit 5, which again is agricultural and rural land use patterns and processes. Okay. So so we did some introductions in class to with agriculture, and obviously there's a lot that goes into this. So let's break it down so that it actually starts making a little bit more sense. Okay. So the enduring understanding for this unit, basically understanding that the availability of resources and cultural practices influence agricultural practices and land use patterns. Okay, so here's the learning objective for at least topic 5.1 here, explaining the connection between physical geography and agricultural practices. So to start off, agriculture is basically the purposeful cultivation of plants or raising of animals to produce goods for survival, right? Geographers study agriculture to understand how humans have modified the environment to sustain themselves. And obviously, technologically speaking, right, there have been a lot of advancements in agriculture in the last 40, 50, 60 years. So we'll get more into that as we get into the unit, right? So yeah, I mean, historically speaking, the first crops to be harvested through agriculture were the crops we the usual suspects, right? Fruits, veggies, grains like corn, wheat, and rice. So even though agriculture is mainly used, to raise crops, it's also used for other things like fiber crops, right? Like cotton or oil, right, for consumption and industrial purposes. Related to agriculture, just as in a beginning understanding of this is environmental factors, right? To successfully cultivate plants or raise animals, adaptation to environmental limitations is required, as agriculture is bound to the physical environment. So basically, adapt or you won't be successful. Okay, and there are four environmental factors that really determine how successful growing crops, raising animals might be, right? Climate, elevation, and soil and topography. So climate is a major influencer of agricultural choices and practices because it provides, precipitation and temperatures needed for seeds to grow, right? I mean, to germinate, I should say, and plants to grow, and livestock to have food needed to survive. So generally speaking, the greater the distance from the equator, the shorter the growing season. And if you're at the equator or in the tropics, right, the growing season can be year round. Elevation is an environmental factor because that affects the growing season and what plants can be grown. Each increase of 1,000 feet above sea level means the corresponding decrease of about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe, or about 4. The higher, the shorter the growing season, right? Soil, right? I mean, that matters because that's the biological active coating of Earth's surface. Topography matters because it's an area's land feature, including the slope of that land, and that affects the ability of the soil to stay in place and retain water. Right, the steeper the slope, the more likely the soil will be affected by a runoff. All right, and give me a few seconds, I'll be right back. Okay, so yeah, the most favorable land has all of the ideal circumstances for these four here: climate, elevation, soil, and topography. But sometimes the landscape can be modified for better environmental factors. For example, terrace farming, which we looked at all the way back in Unit 1. Right, terrace farming reduces soil erosion. Adding fertilizers, for example, enhances the soil fertility for cropland and all of that. But of course, there are negative effects with all of this, which again, we'll be talking about in this unit. All right. So here we are, number 3, climate. Climate varies greatly across the globe and is based on 4 key factors. All right. So distance from the equator, wind and ocean currents, proximity to large bodies of water, and again, topography. So again, all of this determines what types of foods are grown across the globe. So to get a little bit more in depth here, right, distance from the equator, that basically determines the length of daylight and average temperatures. right? The equator, the tropics, right? I mean, those right states, right near the at the equator or near the tropics or at the tropics, right, receive direct rays from the sun all year round, right? Dry bands follow, containing deserts, and then following are temperate zones, right? In between the tropics and the polar circles, uh, they have hot summers. Or, us, for example, right? We have hot summers, colder, cool winters, and transitional springs and autumns, right? Wind and ocean currents affect climate because they circulate colder, warm water and air masses, right, over the surface, right? Circulation of water, air masses affects patterns of temperature and precipitation. So it gets into a little bit more of, physical geography rather than human geography, but I think you get the point about how all of this affects climate across the globe. All right. And here's one form, one way of classifying, the climate zones across the world. It's pretty accurate. You got the tropics, right? You got the, dry lands, temperate zones, right? And then here you kind of got the colder mid latitudes, right? And obviously, right, polar zones. Okay. So yeah, let's get a little bit more into what the CED, the course and exam description, actually wants us to learn, right? Number 4 here, climate zones, right? So I'm getting a little bit more into that. So first climate zone we'll be talking about, the tropical areas, right? Areas with warm temperatures year-round. They vary in their amounts of precipitation. So again, tropics are these areas here, right? Yeah, the wet tropical zones, right? They've got plentiful precipitation, right? Growth of rainforest. The tropical monsoon climates, right? Those in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and West Africa, for example, have heavy rains, dry winters, right? And the type of intensive and intensive agricultural practices you'll see include shifting cultivation and plantation agriculture. But we'll get into that in a moment. Okay, so one more time, right? Tropical climates, hot, humid, produce certain plants like the cassava, bananas, sugar canes, I should say, sweet potatoes, papaya, rice. So, one more time, right? The types of crops grown in these regions. Okay. And obviously that Netflix documentary you've been watching, right, focuses on coconuts. Okay, one more map for you here, just to get an idea. Next, temperate climate zones, where you've got moderate temperatures and adequate precipitation amounts. You got long, warm summers and short winters. The humid temperate climates, those zones, right? Humid and temperate climates, marine west coast climates, and Mediterranean climates are the 3 different, more specific types of temperate climate zones. Okay, so within these zones, though, temperate climate zones, you've got long growing seasons, right? It's home to some major grain producing regions, right? And the types of extensive and intensive agricultural practices you'll see here include commercial gardening, right? Dairy, right? Mixed crop and livestock. All right. Next, we got the Mediterranean climate zone, a little bit more mild, right? What winters are conducive to agriculture here. So the hot, dry summers are ideal for cultivating certain vines and trees. All right. Mediterranean agriculture will usually consist of growing hardy trees like olives, fruits, and nut trees, and shrubs, right, like grapevines, right, and raising sheep and goats. All right. So again, right, the Mediterranean climate is a hot, dry summer climate, mild winter, a defined rainy season, right, that produces fruits, vegetables, and grains. All right. And obviously, given the name, right, the Mediterranean climate zone prevails mainly along, right, the Mediterranean region, okay, but also in parts of California, parts here in Oregon, in central Chile, South Africa's Cape, and parts of Australia, okay. So, I mean, you could kind of mix the Mediterranean zone with the warm mid latitudes, all right. So yeah, again here, you see another map. right? And then again, some some trees here for you. Okay. And then lastly here, the cold mid-latitude zones, right, where there are short, mild summers, but too cold to allow farming. So instead of what you've got here are, the growth of dairy and other grains, right? Wheat, barley, where you raise livestock here and dairy cows, right? And then lastly, the grasslands, the continental steppe, right? So kind of, you could kind of picture it as almost flatlands if you wanted to, right? Where you've got cattle ranching, sheep, goats, horses, camels, right? You raise those, right? And you've got this map, you guys, just of the climate regions here of the world and what you might see grown here. And I realized here the key is kind of cut off, so I'll have to fix that when I upload this PowerPoint. All right. So summarizing all this, you guys, right? Agricultural practice influenced by the physical environment and climate conditions. So taking a look here at each climate zone and, what types of, what crops are grown here, or what animals might be raised. Right. And you don't need to get bogged down in the science of like, what the winters and summers are like here. All right. So we could look a little bit more closely as to what kinds of things are grown in the United States. And we kind of did, some activities in class or inactivity in class about this, right? Testing your knowledge, right? So you got spring wheat in this area, right? Winter wheat in these regions, right? Corn mainly grown there in the Midwest, where rice in the United States would mainly be grown, right? Vegetables, oranges, apples, cotton, peanuts, sugarcane, milk cows, right? And of course, there's some in Oregon, right? If you've ever, driven down south, cattle. Okay, so yeah, agricultural regions of the United States here, right? Good to know, right? Good to know what your country's like. Okay, moving on though, let's talk about intensive agricultural practices. All right, so kind of the second subtopic here in 5.1. Right, intensive agricultural practices, basically an agricultural practice in which farmers expend a great deal of effort to produce as much yield as possible from an area of land. Okay, and this type of practice focuses on achieving high productivity, relying on high levels of inputs and energy, right? And by inputs, I mean like chemical fertilizers, pesticides, growth regulators or animals, and energy, right? Labor, right? I mean, energy is always needed, right? To run machines, to work the land by hand, right? Utilizing various degrees of technology, right? And all of this, of course, is relative to the space being used. So intensive agricultural practices require small plots of land, large amount of labor, necessitates more care throughout the crop season, and is mainly near, densely populated areas. And a quick note for you, if land is scarce or expensive, right, then you can assume, right, and, people there might use it intensively. Okay, so an example of where you might find intensive agricultural practices, right? Paddy rice farming in Southeast Asia and East Asia, right? I mean, clearly, right? Pretty labor intensive, all right? Hence the name. But there are, certain types of intensive agricultural practices. So, for example, you've got the, plantation, agriculture, right? And, this is going to be, found in less developed countries for cheap labor. So corporations and farms can, maximize profits that way, right? And, plantation agriculture usually involves large-scale commercial farming of one particular crop grown for markets, often, pretty far. So, global markets, hence commercial farming. So major plantation crops within plantation agriculture includes cotton, tobacco, tea, coffee, bananas, rubber, palm oil. It's the oldest form of intensive commercial agriculture. It's labor intensive. Plantations are operated by more developed countries, and of course they exploit cheap labor, right? And that bitter chocolate episode that we've been watching is an example of plantation agriculture, right? And the roots of plantation agriculture kind of go back to the times of colonialism and imperialism, where, you know, Europeans in Africa, for example, replace subsistence farming with commercial agriculture. All right. And you'll mainly find plantation agriculture in low latitudes, the tropics, hot, humid climate zones. So, you know, you could take a look here, you know, where you might find these. All right, and again, you know, the growth of cocos is an example, but you know, this picture here, you can kind of get a sense. Plantation agriculture a little. Next, within intensive agricultural practices here, we've got mixed crop and livestock systems. All right, it's an integrated system where both crops and livestock are raised for profits. So these are going to be found in more developed countries. Basically, it's, you know, you grow crops and, you know, livestock at the same time, right? So crops are grown, mainly corn and soybean. They're fed to the livestock to be fattened for slaughter or to be milked, right? And there are kind of two types to this, on farm and between farm mixed crop and livestock systems. On farm is, you know, when you basically raise the crops and the livestock in the same farm. You know, mixed, you know, the between farm is a little bit different. It's, you know, you kind of, you know, are raising crops in, you know, one farm and then livestock in another. So we don't need to get bogged down in that though. But you'll find mixed crop and livestock systems mainly in the United States, West Africa, India. All right. So yeah, combination of cash crops with livestock. Yeah. And here you can kind of get a sense of, you know, where the practices, you know, may be occurring for this. All right. And here we go, right? One of the last ones here with intensive agriculture, market gardening, all right? A type of farming that produces fruits and veggies and flowers. It typically serves a specific market or urban areas. Farmers can sell to local businesses. And these are found in regions where there are longer growing seasons. So again, probably those, you know, temperate zones, right? Those warm, you know, temperate zones, okay? So, these will mainly be near most large cities in the United States. Operators often invest in tech like greenhouses, high quality seeds, fertilizers, pesticides. Right. So keep in mind, market gardening is, you know, small scale food production, right, to sell to local markets. So, you know, think of, you know, a local farm, you know, selling, you know, at a local farmer's market, right? And the practice of market gardening is kind of driven by the perishability of products, or their likeliness to spoil, right? And also by the demand by local consumers, right, for fruits and veggies. Right. So successful market gardens, they cultivate high yields on small tracts of land. All right. And you know, you'll see it both in rural areas and urban areas. Okay. All right, let's move on here. Extensive agricultural practices. So this is an agricultural practice with relatively few inputs and little investment in labor and capital results in relatively low outputs. So with extensive agricultural practices, it requires more land, a less amount of human labor, and necessitates less care throughout the season. So these are going to be found in less developed countries, these practices, and in areas where intensive agricultural isn't feasible. And another note there for you, if land is plentiful and costs little, you can assume it'll be used extensively. And like intensive agriculture, we'll find specific types here. So we've got shifting cultivation, right? The practice of growing crops or grazing animals on a piece of land for a year or two, and then abandoning that land when the nutrients have been depleted from the soil, and moving to a new piece of land where the process is repeated. So this requires a relatively large area that you're going to operate in over time. All right. Not that you'll be necessarily like using, you know, a big, you know, chunk of land for the short run. All right. Something good to know here is that it's the largest utilized type of extensive farming practice in the world. And one technique that's kind of associated with shifting cultivation is the slash and burn technique. All right. So shifting cultivation, located in more tropical climate zones, right? Agricultural land, again, is identified and then cleared. right? And again, that whole process. So you'll mainly find this in Southeast Asia, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa. And the slash and burn technique is here for you, right, to get a sense of, how this process works, right? Really simplistic though, right? Forest vegetation is cleared by cutting and burning. The resulting layer of ash then contributes to the soil's fertility. And then farmers move to another parcel of land when the soil becomes infertile. You wait a year or two, and then again, the process. Nomadic herding and ranching, right? Another one of extensive agriculture, right? So nomadic herding, basically, seasonal migration of domesticated livestock, usually between highland and lowlands. This requires far-reaching areas of land to prevent overgrazing, right? And overgrazing again is the destruction of feed plants, right? That results from livestock overpopulation and feeding. Okay. So with nomadic herding, the climate is dry. Herders are on the move, right, with their goats, cattle, sheep, and right, they're going to lack, economic development, and the local environment is kind of dictating, how they're going to practice their agriculture. All right. Yeah. And then lastly, tied in with this is ranching, right? The business of raising livestock, cattle and sheep, right, for commercial purposes, right? So it would be, commercial agriculture. And, ranching is going to be located away from urban centers. It's going to require large plots of land, but only meant for animal grazing and roaming on a fixed piece of land. So this map, right, you'll see areas of nomadic herding around the world. All right. And yeah, to kind of, finish up 5.1 here, here you'll see agricultural regions around the world. All right. So keeping in mind the climate zones and then what exactly is being practiced. All right. So it's a good map to kind of to look at and pause and think for a little. And, related to that, again, for each agricultural practice, right, at least the one that we looked at, we didn't really look at grain or dairy, but you can kind of, get a sense of what climate zone they might be in and their locations. Okay. So, honestly, and I probably say this as a teacher, but it isn't too difficult to kind of, put climate and agricultural practices together and, kind of memorize, right? Where you might find plantation agriculture, right? Or commercial gardening, right? Okay, and one more tool or resource for you here, purposes of agriculture, right? What kinds of intensive agricultural practices would be considered commercial or subsistence, right? And subsistence meaning, local for you, right? Not to be sold to, major corporations. Okay, let's get into 5.2 here, right? Settlement patterns and survey methods. All right. So the learning objective in this one is to identify different rural settlement patterns and methods of surveying rural settlements. So it's a pretty quick one, right? So rural settlement patterns, basically specific agricultural practices shape different rural land use patterns, and rural settlement patterns are classified as either clustered, dispersed, linear, and we're going to be looking at those three there. So, just think about what can be grown in certain climates and, how that'll affect land use, right? So thinking about, what a potato farm looks like, corn, cattle. All right. So the first one is going to be clustered settlements. The first one we're going to be looking at. All right. And again, rural settlement patterns. All right. Totally different than rural surveying methods. Okay. So clustered settlements. All right. These are sometimes referred to as nuclei. All right. So it's the most common form of settlement. It's basically where you're going to have homes, buildings, and people in close proximity, where interaction is high, right? Social unity is kind of, the name of the game here, all right? So, yeah, and around these settlements, you'll find farmland and pasture land, all right? And residents are going to be sharing common resources, expanding their land outward. So, clustered here for you, that's what it might look like, or this one again. And again, you can get a sense of what's surrounding them. Again, farmland, pasture land. Second, we've got dispersed settlements. All right. Houses and buildings are isolated from one another and distributed over a relatively large area. All right. These are going to exist in areas with difficult terrain, right? But instead of promoting, social unity, it's going to be promoting independence and self-sufficiency. All right. So you will find dispersed settlements like this. You'll definitely find a lot of it in Oregon. All right, linear settlements. Houses and buildings extend in a long line. They usually follow a land feature, like coast or hill, or lines along a transportation route. All right, so people settle along these features because, they provide access to water or transportation. All right, and here you'll find a linear settlement, or it could look something like this here. All right, so somewhat related to that, but of course different, are rural survey methods. Rural survey methods include meets and bounds, township and range, and long lot. So land ownership requires, the boundaries of one owner's land to be clearly differentiated from those of another's land. And that's what rural survey methods try to do. Okay, and they're used to determine a property's three-dimensional position of points and the distances and angles between them. So the first rural survey method we've got here is meets and bounds. Okay, meets and bounds, an imprecise system of land surveying relying on land descriptions of land ownership and natural features such as streams or trees. So, something I should have mentioned here actually. Rural survey methods, right? These are kind of historical examples of survey methods and kind of how they've shaped how the land looks in the United States. All right, in Canada as well. Anyways, meets and bounds, the shape does not conform to a rectangular system. Property boundaries are drawn in certain directions for a specific distance from clear points of reference. All right, so what I mean by that is, the points of reference, right, are going to be, a natural feature. And, I'll come back to that example there so you get a sense of what that means exactly. So yeah, it's called meets and bounds because, the meets basically referring to straight lines that connect different points of a geographic feature, while bounds are key geographic features that define an area. So again, you can see the lines here, but the points are going to be natural features, right? Streams or trees, right? I'll be back. Give me a couple of seconds. All right. So again, you'll see another example, right, of meets and bounds through this aerial image right here. So there you go. Yeah, it's mainly a 17th century system. Great Britain mainly used it, right, for the northern colonies, and you'll see this kind of pattern, right, in the East Coast, right, where the colonies formerly were. All right. Again, you'll see the weird shapes here. All right, number 5, we've got township and range. Right, so township and range, a rectangular survey system used by the United States government to divide the land into a grid. All right, so these were designed to create survey townships, so 6 by 6 or 36 square miles, and each square will contain about 640 acres of land. All right, and this uses latitude and longitude and a baseline to create a grid-like pattern to record land ownership. All right, and this was kind of done not after, people kind of settled into an area, but before. So it's pre-settlement. Okay. And, this was mainly, practiced, as the United States was expanding westward. So you'll find, this kind of pattern of, of neat squares, right? If you're looking from the sky, right? So the further west you go, starting from the East Coast. All right, so this is what it's going to look like. Again, you can see the baseline, right? You can see the squares here, 6 by 6. All right. And, if you've ever, flown across, right, in the Midwest, right, you'll see patterns like this, or maybe something like this. Okay. Last year we got the long lot system. All right. So a long lot is divided land into narrow parcels stretching back from rivers, roads, or canals, giving each household equal access to water resources. All right. So property is divided into a series of adjacent long strips of land, and it's mainly common in French areas in the United States. So like where the French used to rule, right? Louisiana, parts of Missouri, and in French Canada. All right, and the system allows for equal access to waterway and a mix of soils. All right, so it'll this is a drawing. It's better if you see something like this, for example, right? Clearly, you can see why it would be called a long lot system, right? Because the pieces of land here are pretty long, and they look like they're pretty rectangular and straight. All right, you can kind of see it, in Google Maps too, like this. All right. So who practices what? Again, you can kind of get a sense of the historical use of these surveys. Again, like I said, meets and bounds was mainly used by the British, the North American colonies here, the American colonies. The long lot system, again, where the French kind of used to rule in the United States, or where they had land, right? And then township and range, again, that was done in the 19th century, right? As the U.S. expanded westward. Okay. So there we go, you guys. 5.1, 5.2, definitely a lot to consider there. I recommend you go back to the CED, kind of look at the big points that were discussed, and don't get bogged down in the very little details, but really get a sense of the climate regions of the world and the agricultural regions of the world, like this one here. Okay, and yeah, we'll be set to go for the unit. All right, we're gonna go full speed ahead now after looking at these two topics. So yeah, get ready for some good discussions, guys. All right. Anyways, let me know if you have questions, really, and I'll see you next time.